In August 1914, as the world slid into war, a wooden ship called Endurance slipped quietly out of Plymouth Harbor. Her captain, Ernest Shackleton, a man already famous across Britain for failing, twice before, to reach the South Pole. This time his goal was even bigger and even more dangerous. Not just to stand at the pole, but to walk clean across the entire continent of Antarctica, coast to coast, roughly 1,800 miles. Something no human being had ever attempted, let alone achieved. 27 men signed on for the voyage, alongside more than 60 sled dogs, and even a ship's cat named Mrs. Chippy. None of them knew they were about to live through one of the greatest survival stories in human history, and, strangely enough, not one of them would ever actually set foot on the Antarctic continent at all. The ship herself was named after Shackleton's own family motto, "By endurance we conquer." It would turn out to be the most fitting name a ship has ever carried. Built in Norway for polar work, her hull was reinforced with extra oak and greenheart timber, designed to survive exactly the kind of punishment the Weddell Sea was about to deliver. By January 1915, Endurance was deep inside the Weddell Sea, just one single day's sail from the coast of Antarctica. So close. Then the temperature dropped hard, and the wind shifted. The pack ice around her began to close in, floe grinding against floe like the slow closing of a giant jaw. Within hours, the ship was frozen solid, gripped on every side, unable to move forward, unable to move back. Shackleton stood on deck and understood immediately what this meant. He had a rule for moments exactly like this one. When a plan dies, you replace it instantly, without wasting a single hour on regret. He turned the trapped ship into a winter station. The crew hunted seals and penguins for food and fuel, fed and trained the sled dogs on the ice, played football and hockey in the freezing air, put on theatrical shows below deck, and waited, month after month, for the southern summer to melt their way free. Summer never freed them. Month after month, the ice held Endurance prisoner, and slowly, patiently, relentlessly, it began to crush her. The pressure built for nearly 10 months until, in October 1915, the sound of splitting timber cracked across the frozen silence like rifle fire. Beams the thickness of a man's leg snapped like matchsticks. Water poured into the hold. Shackleton walked the deck one final time and gave the order every captain dreads above all others: abandon ship. His men could only stand out on the ice, in the dark and the cold, and watch their vessel, their only shelter, their only workshop, their only way home, get slowly crushed and swallowed whole by the very sea that had trapped it. 28 men now stood alone on a drifting slab of sea ice, somewhere in the middle of one of the most hostile oceans on Earth, with 3 small lifeboats salvaged from the wreck, a few tons of supplies, and almost no realistic chance of rescue. No one back home knew where they were, or whether any of them were still alive. Their camp, grimly nicknamed Patience Camp, would be their only home for months to come, drifting slowly north with the ocean current toward nothing but open, freezing sea. What kept them alive, from the very first hour on the ice, was Shackleton himself. He was not the strongest sailor aboard, not the most skilled navigator, but he understood something almost every disaster story proves true. The difference between survivors and corpses is usually leadership, not luck. He rationed food personally. He gave away his own gloves to a man who had lost his. He rotated tent assignments so no one was ever isolated with the same handful of people for too long, quietly diffusing tension before it could turn into despair. He banned open discussion of death or hopelessness around the camp because he understood that morale in a place like this was as vital to survival as food or shelter. There was also a darker, quieter decision made in those first days that revealed just how serious their situation truly was. With food running low and every extra mouth a threat to the group's survival, some of the weakest sled dogs and the beloved ship's cat, Mrs. Chippy, had to be put down. It was one of the hardest orders Shackleton ever gave, and several men never fully forgave him for it. But it bought the group precious weeks of food, weeks that would matter enormously in the disaster still waiting ahead. None of them could imagine that the ice beneath their tents was only the first, and by far the easiest, chapter of the ordeal still to come. For nearly 5 months, the crew drifted helplessly on their shrinking, cracking ice floe, sleeping in patched tents through Antarctic storms, rationing what little food remained, and watching their frozen world slowly break apart beneath their own boots. Seal meat, penguin meat, and eventually their remaining sled dogs kept them alive, but barely. Some men began losing weight so fast, their clothes hung off them like sails with no wind. When the ice finally grew too thin and unstable to hold them any longer. In April 1916, Shackleton made a desperate call. Launch the 3 lifeboats into open freezing water and try to reach land before the floe disappeared beneath them completely. For 5 brutal days, the men battled towering waves, biting spray that froze instantly on their skin, and hidden chunks of ice that could shatter a wooden hull in seconds. Sleep was almost impossible. Thirst became a serious danger, since drinking seawater would kill them, and there was no fresh water to spare. Then, almost impossibly, land appeared on the horizon. They reached Elephant Island, a jagged, storm-battered rock at the edge of the Southern Ocean. It was the first solid ground any of them had stood on in 497 days. Grown men, hardened sailors, wept openly and kissed the stones beneath their feet. But their celebration didn't last. Elephant Island was barren, freezing, and far from any shipping route. No ship would ever pass close enough to spot them. If they stayed, they would eventually starve or freeze, quietly, with no one on Earth ever knowing what happened to them. Rescue was not going to come looking for them. Someone had to go find it, and fast, before the Antarctic winter closed in completely. Shackleton chose 5 of his strongest and most capable men, and the sturdiest of the 3 lifeboats, a 22-foot open vessel named the James Caird, and prepared for what remains, even by today's standards, one of the most extraordinary small boat voyages in maritime history. Their target, a tiny Norwegian whaling station on the island of South Georgia, 800 miles away across the most violent, storm-ridden stretch of ocean on the planet. For 17 days, the 6 men were thrown around by hurricane-force winds and waves the height of buildings, soaked constantly in freezing spray, sleeping in shifts on wet sleeping bags inside a boat, barely large enough to lie down in. Their navigator, Frank Worsley, had to calculate their position using only a sextant, a chronometer, and brief, precious glimpses of the sun through storm clouds. Knowing a navigational error of just a few miles could mean missing the island entirely, with no second chance. Remarkably, his calculations were almost perfectly accurate. They cited South Georgia. But fate was not finished testing them. They had landed on the wrong side of the island, cut off from the whaling station by an unmapped, jagged mountain range that no human being had ever crossed before, in weather no sane person would attempt it in. So Shackleton, half frozen, exhausted, and running on almost no real sleep for weeks, climbed it anyway, with two of his strongest remaining men beside him, using nothing but a carpenter's adze and a length of rope as climbing gear. 36 straight hours later, filthy, frostbitten, and barely recognizable as human, the three men staggered down into the whaling station at Stromness and startled the first person they met, a young boy who ran away in terror at the sight of them. Word quickly reached the station manager, a man who had personally met Shackleton years earlier, and even so, could barely believe this ragged, bearded figure standing in front of him was the same man. But the hardest task of all still remained, sailing back across that same brutal ocean to rescue the 22 men still stranded on Elephant Island. It took 4 separate rescue attempts and several long, agonizing months as thick pack ice repeatedly turned back ship after ship, forcing Shackleton to watch helplessly from the deck each time, knowing every failed attempt meant more days of starvation for the men he had promised to save. Finally, on the 30th of August, 1916, a small steam tug named Yelko broke through the ice, and Shackleton spotted his men still camped on that same frozen beach, exactly where he had left them over 4 months earlier, alive and waiting. Every single one of them was alive. 28 men had sailed south into the ice in 1914. 28 men walked back out alive in 1916. Through a shipwreck, a winter stranded on drifting ice, an open boat crossing of the world's most dangerous ocean, and an unmapped mountain climb on foot. Against every possible odd, not one single life was lost. It remains, even today, one of the greatest true survival stories ever recorded.